I discovered that my wife was having a hidden romantic dinner with her lover, so I went over to them, and when she saw me, she was open-mouthed and shocked, as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. I will never forget the expression that froze on her face, the look of panic mixed with shame, the moment she realized that the entire illusion, the entire act, had collapsed. For months, I carried on my shoulders the cold certainty that something was wrong, but I denied it to myself. I preferred to believe that it was just stress, tiredness, routine, anything other than the obvious, any excuse that would spare me the devastation that today runs through my veins like poison. For weeks, I noticed small signs, the distant touch, the eyes that no longer reached me, the empty smiles, and the rush to leave under banal pretexts. I tried to ignore it, I tried to justify it, I tried to fight the growing suspicion that gnawed at my days and haunted my nights. But that night, that damn night, I knew. She had said she would go out with friends for a girls' dinner, something harmless, something I encouraged her to do, trying to rekindle some joy in her. I wanted to believe. God knows I wanted to. But restlessness was eating me up inside, and when I saw a notification on her phone left on the couch, a message that simply said, "Looking forward to seeing you, beautiful," my blood ran cold. My fingers shook as I held the device, my heart threatened to break through my ribs. And that was how, with a broken heart and a torn soul, I went to the restaurant where she smiled at another man like she hadn't smiled at me in a long time. As I walked through the restaurant doors, my eyes immediately caught her. She wore the red dress that I had given her for our wedding anniversary. She was beautiful, radiant, alive in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. But it wasn't for me. It was for him. I saw her laugh at something he said, leaning forward, touching his hand with the intimacy of someone who has forgotten everything they've ever experienced before. My world collapsed in slow motion. I walked up to the table, and the sound of my shoes' heel against the floor seemed to echo in her ears, because the moment she saw me, her eyes widened as if she had seen a ghost. The glass of wine almost slipped out of his hands, his lips parted, unable to form a single word. The man, unconcerned, turned to me with a cynical smile, as if nothing wrong was happening. "Surprise," I said, my voice cutting through the air like a blade. The silence that fell over the table was deafening. She stuttered, babbling something unintelligible, desperately searching for an excuse, a saving lie. But there weren't enough words in the world to cover up that betrayal. My chest felt like it was about to explode, my head was throbbing. I wanted to scream, I wanted to destroy everything around me, but I stopped myself. I wouldn't give them the pleasure of seeing me fall. Without taking my eyes off her, I asked with an icy smile, "A dinner between friends, right?" She blinked quickly, as if she could erase the scene from my memory, as if she could rewrite history with just the despair in her eyes. The lover, now uncomfortable, tried to intervene, but I raised my hand, silencing him with a gesture that carried all the accumulated fury of years of wasted love. She tried to get up, reaching for my hand as if she still had some right to touch me, but I stepped back, and the sudden movement made her chair creak. People around us began to observe us, whispering among themselves, some already discreetly pulling out their cell phones to record the impending scandal. "You know," I continued, unable to hide the bitterness in my voice, "the most impressive thing isn't the betrayal. It's the courage to put on the dress I gave you to find another man. It's the audacity to look me in the eye every day and lie like I'm a complete idiot." She was crying now, tears that aroused no compassion in me. The man tried again to justify himself, but shame made him stumble over his own words. I looked around, taking in every curious look, every whisper, every shocked expression. It wasn't just dinner. It was the funeral of everything I believed to be true. I left without waiting for a response. I didn't want to hear lame excuses or empty promises. I wanted distance. I wanted to breathe. I wanted to understand at what moment the person who promised to walk beside me decided to take another path, hidden, dirty, despicable. But fate, always cruelly ironic, still had more to show me. That night, I thought I had hit rock bottom. I thought that nothing could be worse than seeing with my own eyes the crumbling of what we built together. But I was mistaken. Very mistaken. Days later, while I was still trying to piece together what was left of me, I discovered that that night was far from the end of the humiliation. Little did I know that not only was she being unfaithful, but that the encounter itself had been planned to appear casual. Mutual friends knew. People close to me knew. I was the last to know. And worse, I myself, unconsciously, had financed many of the moments they shared. Every dinner, every gift, every escape, a part of me was there, sponsoring my own destruction. As I struggled between anger and despair, a decision took shape within me. I wouldn't just be the victim. I wouldn't be the man who cries alone in the dark. I wouldn't be the one who crawls around asking for explanations. If she had chosen to destroy everything, I would choose to rebuild. But not with her. Never with her again. And it was like that, with my heart in tatters and my eyes open with pain, that I charted my new path. A path that would lead me to something that neither she, nor he, nor anyone else expected. A path that would begin at rock bottom, but would end at the height of a subtle, elegant and devastating revenge. What happened after that night in the restaurant, what was revealed in the weeks that followed, and the way they each paid the price for their actions, was something that not even in her worst nightmares could she have predicted. The curious thing is that, at the moment I thought my love story was over, I realized that it was just beginning for real, in other arms, in a way that no one could ever imagine. But, who was the person who reached out to me when I no longer believed in anything? Who taught me that, even after the greatest betrayal, love could still be reborn? This is a story that needs to be heard until the end. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support, encourage or romanticize any type of betrayal. All the stories told are fictional and have the sole objective of showing how much betrayal destroys lives, dreams and families. Get ready now to dive into an intense story, full of emotion and twists. A story that will leave you breathless. Buckle up, because what comes next is simply shocking. Daniel always believed that love was a slow construction, made up of small daily gestures, looks that said more than words and comfortable silences that didn't require explanations. It was this type of love that he said he found in Laura, years ago, on an ordinary afternoon that, without warning, changed the course of his life. She, with her shy smile and her eyes that seemed to hold stories that he would never tire of hearing, brought a meaning to his existence that he didn't even know he was looking for before. It was the perfect combination. He was methodical, dreamy and protective, she, spontaneous, full of life and with a disconcerting ease to make even pain seem bearable. The life they built together was, for all eyes that observed them, the portrait of harmony, of the marriage that anyone would want to have. The house they bought on the outskirts of the city was large, bright, full of spaces designed for a future they planned as a couple, children running barefoot in the garden, birthday parties full of people, summer nights chatting under the stars in the backyard. At first, every detail seemed magical. Daniel would arrive home from work and find Laura with a welcoming smile, dinner perfuming the house, the sound of soft music filling the space between them. He loved the way she leaned against the doorframe as she told him about her day, gesturing excitedly, her eyes shining as she told even the most banal stories. On the weekends, he made an effort to plan things he knew she loved, picnics in the park, visits to art shows, short trips to nearby towns. Nothing was exaggerated, everything was simple, but the intensity with which they lived these moments was what made it all worth it. Daniel felt he had found not just a wife, but his best friend, his confidant, his accomplice in all the discreet follies of adult life. Laura, in turn, seemed genuinely happy next to him. I liked decorating the house with personal touches, hand-painted paintings, scented candles in each room, colorful blankets thrown carelessly on the sofa. He had a gift for transforming cold spaces into welcoming homes. And it was this ability to make any environment a refuge that most enchanted Daniel. He watched her, sometimes in silence, feeling an almost childish pride in having her by his side. There was something about Laura that made everything less heavy, less urgent, more bearable. It was as if, by his side, time lost its rush and life finally became what it should be, a safe space to be happy. Their circle of friends was small but solid. Casual dinners at home, late afternoon meetings for cold beers, board games that went on until the early hours. Laura was always the center of these meetings, with her welcoming manner and her contagious laugh. Everyone adored her, and Daniel, in particular, felt fortunate to be her chosen one. There was no better feeling in the world than belonging to someone he considered so special. Sometimes, when he looked at her sleeping next to him, with her hair spread out on the pillow and her breathing light, Daniel was invaded by an almost sacred feeling of gratitude. He made silent plans, intimate promises to protect that peace at any cost. Daniel's work, although demanding, was never an obstacle between them. On the contrary, he made a point of making time for Laura, for both of them. Whenever he traveled for work, he brought symbolic gifts, small gestures that said, "I thought of you." He knew that absence, if poorly cared for, could corrode even the most solid loves, and he swore to himself that he would never allow that to happen between them. Laura showed understanding, said she was proud of his career and made a point of making the home a place of rest and welcome when he returned. Over the years, they established routines that looked more like sacred rituals. Breakfast together on Saturdays, walking hand in hand in the park on Sundays, the movie on Friday night, always with homemade popcorn. It was these little things that supported the invisible castle they built around themselves. Even when disagreements arose, as in every real and imperfect relationship, they knew how to step back, apologize, find in the other the part that was missing for peace to be reconstructed. There was no room for lasting hurts, for aggressive silences, for unhealed wounds. Daniel was proud to say he was happy. A silent, mature happiness, made not of explosions of adolescent passion, but of the serenity that comes from love that has already gone through the trials of life and remained. He felt safe, anchored, and saw Laura as the port he could always return to, no matter how stormy the seas were outside. In moments of uncertainty, it was her I thought of; in his achievements, he wanted to celebrate with her; in times of sadness, it was in his arms that I sought comfort. Their love was, for Daniel, living evidence that life, with all its imperfections, could be wonderful. Therefore, when small changes appeared in Laura, subtle things, almost imperceptible to those who didn't know her that well, Daniel, at first, ignored them. He attributed it to the new responsibilities at her job, the pressures of adult life, the inevitable passage of time itself that changes even the things we love. The occasional distance in her eyes, the inexplicable rush on certain afternoons, the phone left out of reach for longer than usual, all were justified within Daniel by an almost childish faith in the goodness of the life they had together. Laura, however, seemed increasingly restless, even though she tried to mask her feelings with smiles and mechanical gestures of affection. Her eyes, once full of light, now seemed to carry shadows that she dared not explain. When Daniel hugged her, he sometimes noticed a slight stiffness in her body, as if, somewhere inside, she was moving away to a place where he couldn't reach her. But he chose to believe, he chose to trust, he chose to love, because he didn't know how to live any other way. On their wedding anniversary, Daniel organized a dinner at home, something intimate, just the two of them, surrounded by the memories of everything they built. Laura smiled, thanked her, seemed moved, but her eyes didn't shine like before. Daniel noticed, but swallowed his discomfort as if he refused to look at a crack in the foundation of his own house. He thought maybe it was just tiredness; he thought that a trip for two, which he had been planning for months, could rekindle what seemed to be slowly extinguishing. He booked a weekend at a charming inn by the lake, imagining that the refuge away from everything and everyone could bring them closer together. While Laura distractedly packed her bags, Daniel watched her in silence, feeling a tightness in his chest that he couldn't name. She seemed to be there, but his mind wandered to places he wasn't invited to. Still, he persisted, insisted, because that's what he did out of love, believe, even when the ground began to crack beneath his feet. During the trip, there were moments when everything seemed to return to normal, sincere laughter, complicit looks, clasped hands. But there were also heavy silences, inexplicable distractions, absences in the midst of the presence. Daniel chose to see what he wanted to see. He chose to believe that, together, they could still overcome anything. Laura, in her moments of affection, still said, "I love you," still rested her head on his shoulder on cold nights, still smiled at him in a way that made the world outside disappear. And that was what he held on to with all his might, without knowing that, behind that smile, something was hidden that would forever change the story he thought he knew so well. The return home was peaceful, and Daniel, full of renewed hope, believed that they had found their way again. In the following days, he planned surprises, dreamed of new projects for the two of them, even began to consider the possibility that they were ready to take the next step, to start the family they so wanted to build together. In his mind, nothing was more certain than the future that would continue, firmly, alongside the woman he loved more than himself. Little did Daniel know that, beneath the apparently calm surface, gigantic waves were already forming, ready to drag him into a shipwreck that he would never forget. The first breeze of this storm was already whispering through the corridors of the house, through the calculatedly soft gestures, the furtive glances and the words that were beginning to sound hollow. But, like every passionate sailor, Daniel refused to listen to the call of danger. Until, on an ordinary day, without any warning, everything would change in such a brutal way that he would wonder if he had ever really met the woman who now shared that home with him. After returning from the trip, Daniel's life seemed to slip into a different, colder routine, like a winter that arrived stealthily, without him being able to know when the heat began to dissipate. Laura's gaze, once full of life, now seemed absent, even when she smiled, even when her hands searched for his on the bed in the early hours of the morning. Daniel, with his heart still boiling with love and hope, tried to fill the void that was created between them with grand gestures, carefully planned evenings, flowers left in unexpected places, loving messages sent during work hours, as reminders of how important she was to him. But Laura, instead of getting closer, seemed more and more distant, and the silence that grew between them began to become deafening. Still, Daniel refused to be suspicious. It was easier to blame stress, the rush of everyday life, than to accept that something that seemed so solid was starting to crumble. The days went by strangely. Laura's small slips went unnoticed by anyone who didn't look closely, but for Daniel, who knew her in her details, they were like silent alarms that echoed inside him. Excuses came more frequently, meetings that went on for longer, dinners with colleagues who showed up at the last minute, commitments that kept her away for longer than usual. When he proposed activities for two, Laura would automatically smile and decline with explanations that seemed rehearsed. Daniel, wrapped up in his internal struggle to keep the marriage flame alive, continued to pretend he didn't see the signs. He devoted himself more to work, to renovating the garden, to anything that would stop him from thinking about her absences. Still, on sleepless nights, it was impossible to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that tightened your chest, the screaming intuition that something was very wrong. One afternoon, while tidying up the garage, he found a different scarf, forgotten in the back seat of Laura's car. It wasn't hers, he was sure of that. The perfume permeated into the fabric was sickly, sweet, and strange to what Laura used to wear. He held the handkerchief between his fingers for a few minutes, as if the piece could tell him a story he didn't want to hear. He kept the object without confronting her, thinking it would be petty to suspect something that could have 1,000 innocent explanations. What really ate at him was knowing that his mind was starting to create scenarios, to distrust the woman he had spent his entire life with. Fridays, which were once sacred to them, began to become lonely. Daniel found himself sitting alone on the couch, with the movie playing on the television like a distant noise, while Laura sent quick messages saying that she would be late, that something had come up at work, that she would make up for it later. He compensated with hasty kisses, with soulless caresses, with apologies that seemed written for a distant audience. And every gesture she made, every sentence that escaped her, felt like a small stab that Daniel tried to ignore, trying to stay upright in the face of a castle that was crumbling inch by inch. One day, in one of those rare encounters they still had, Laura casually mentioned a friend Daniel had never heard of. She said that they had been meeting to catch up, that it was good to get out of their routine, that it was good to have some time for herself. Daniel nodded, supported, thinking that, perhaps, freedom would renew what seemed to die within them. I didn't know yet that this freedom was just the veneer of a carefully constructed lie, fueled by fake smiles and well-calculated excuses. As the weeks went by, this friendship became a recurring reason for nights out, day trips to cool off, meetings that no longer included Daniel, but were justified with speeches about independence and mutual trust. The definitive snap came on a cold Saturday night, when, after a series of unanswered messages, Daniel decided to go out to clear his mind. He drove aimlessly through the dark streets, his hands gripping the steering wheel with unnecessary force, the radio playing softly songs that couldn't fill the hole that grew inside him. The car seemed to take him alone to some destination he didn't yet know what it was. Until, as he passed by an elegant restaurant, something caught his attention. Through the lit window, among decorated tables and muffled laughter, he saw her. Laura. Sitting across from a man Daniel had never seen before. Dressed with care that he hadn't seen in a long time, smiling in a way that seemed reserved just for that moment, for that stranger. The impact was so strong that Daniel had to pull over the car. His heart was pounding in his chest, his hands were sweating, and for a moment he thought about simply walking away, pretending he hadn't seen her, sparing himself from the inevitable pain he knew would come if he crossed that line. But something stronger pushed him out of the car. Every step he took toward the restaurant seemed to increase the weight of the world on his shoulders. The warm lights, the smell of refined food, the sounds of cutlery clinking on plates, everything seemed to mock him, his ignorance, his blind faith. As he pushed open the glass door, the soft bell announced his entrance and, as if in a choreographed scene, Laura looked up and saw him. Time stopped. Her eyes widened, the wine glass wavered in her hand, the smile froze on her lips, the color drained from her face. The man in front of him also turned around, confused, looking at Daniel as if facing an unforeseen threat. A few meters away from them, Daniel could smell Laura's perfume, mixed with the metallic odor of betrayal. He approached the table with firm steps, feeling every eye in the restaurant turn to him, an involuntary spectator of a drama that was getting out of control. Laura tried to smile, tried to get up, tried to mumble something that could contain the impending disaster, but it was too late. Daniel stopped in front of them and looked at her with a calm that even he didn't know where it came from, a calm that was pure poison, pure contained despair. Laura opened her mouth to speak, but Daniel raised his hand, asking for silence. He looked into her eyes, not to seek explanations, but to engrave that image in his memory, to never forget the pain of seeing someone he loved smiling at someone else in the same way he no longer smiled at him. Without a word, he turned and left the restaurant, feeling behind him the weight of curious looks, of whispers filled with judgment. He walked to his car like someone crossing a minefield, each step echoing confirmation of everything his soul refused to believe. Inside the car, the silence was absolute, only the irregular sound of your breathing filled the space. The tears didn't come. Not yet. The shock was so great that it seemed to block any emotional reaction. The steering wheel between his hands felt cold and distant. For a few minutes, Daniel just stood there, staring into space, trying to understand where along the way he had lost Laura, or if she had ever really been his. But what Daniel didn't know was that betrayal, brutal and inhumane in itself, was just the surface of something even more devastating. What I was about to discover wasn't just any infidelity, it wasn't just the breaking of vows and promises. There was something more, something hidden in the shadows of that fake relationship, something that would turn his entire world upside down in a way he couldn't have imagined in his worst nightmares. And as he stared at the reflection of his own face in the rearview mirror, not recognizing the man he had become that night, the first spark of something new lit in his chest. It wasn't forgiveness, nor pain. It was something darker, deeper, something that would prepare him to face truths that until then, he had not even dared to imagine. What he didn't yet know was that the betrayal scene that night would only be the beginning. And the secret hidden behind the scenes of this story, was still about to emerge. Daniel spent the next few days in a kind of feverish state, as if his mind refused to accept the reality before him, as if, at any moment, he would wake up from that nightmare and find Laura smiling in the kitchen, preparing coffee, calling him by the nickname that only she used. But the days were cold and silent, her absence seemed to scream through the halls of the house, soaking every corner with the weight of what had been discovered. The messages she sent, trying to explain the inexplicable, trying to sew together with torn words what had been brutally broken, were ignored by him with the coldness of someone who had finally understood that he had lost something precious forever. Until one morning, when he opened the mailbox, he found an anonymous envelope, without a return address, containing only a photo, Laura and the same man from the restaurant, embracing intimately, inside a room that Daniel immediately recognized as being in a local hotel. On the back, handwritten, a dry sentence, "This is just the beginning." The shock of that revelation was like a punch in the stomach, but instead of paralyzing him, it awakened something inside Daniel, a visceral need to know the whole truth, to tear the veil of lies that still covered that miserable story. He spent the entire day on high alert, connecting dots, revisiting conversations, recalling lame excuses, every little detail now making sense within a new, grim context. At night, when the doorbell rang, he knew it was her. He opened the door and found Laura there, curled up, looking smaller than he remembered, as if guilt had eaten away part of her essence. Her eyes were swollen, her makeup smudged, her expression desperate. Without saying anything, he stepped aside to let her enter. She walked through the house as if stepping on sacred territory, as if she felt that it no longer belonged to her, her eyes wandering over the objects, the photos on the wall, as if she were searching for some echo of the woman she once was. When she finally turned to face him, the tension between them was so thick it seemed to make the air almost unbreathable. Laura tried to speak, but her voice broke. Daniel remained silent, his arms crossed, his gaze hard, waiting. When she finally managed to muster the strength to speak, her words came out in broken spurts, mixed with tears that no longer caused compassion, only tiredness. He said he needed to explain, that what he saw in the restaurant was real, but that wasn't everything. That there were motives, reasons, circumstances that he didn't know. Daniel let out a bitter laugh, sarcastically asking what else there could be to explain a romantic dinner on the sly. Laura, trembling, insisted that he needed to listen to the end, that he owed it to himself if he wanted to understand the extent of everything that had happened. Against his will, Daniel nodded. Maybe out of pride, maybe out of a last need to understand where, exactly, everything had broken. Laura then revealed what he would never have imagined. She said that the man she was seeing was not just a lover, he was also an old acquaintance, someone who had been part of their lives in an indirect way. The initial shock gave way to growing astonishment when she, between sobs, told him that he was none other than Daniel's best childhood friend, someone who had been separated for years due to trivial differences and disappeared from their lives without leaving a trace. The same friend who, in secret, had never stopped harboring an unhealthy resentment against Daniel, envying his career, his marriage, his seemingly perfect life. Laura's words cut like razors as she confessed that the reunion had been planned, arranged with care. The man learned about her routine, learned about her weaknesses through social networks, from mutual acquaintances, and approached Laura when she was most vulnerable, offering charm, attention and promises that Daniel, immersed in his occasional absences, hadn't realized she missed. Laura cried as she admitted to having felt desired in a way she hadn't felt in a long time, to having been seduced by the attention, by the illusion of being the center of someone's world again. Daniel could feel the ground open beneath his feet. Laura's every word sounded like dynamite exploding everything that was left of her old life. The physical betrayal was devastating enough, but knowing that everything had been orchestrated, that they had made him a target, a piece in a perverse game, was something that surpassed any pain he had ever imagined himself capable of enduring. Laura continued talking, trying to justify herself, saying that, at some point, she had thought about telling everything, that the weight of guilt consumed her, that there wasn't a single day that went by in which she didn't feel like the worst creature. But each word sounded empty, useless, like useless patches on a fabric torn into 1,000 pieces. When she finished, the silence between them was so absolute that you could hear your own blood pounding in your ears. Daniel looked at Laura, seeing her as if she were a stranger, a woman who had nothing to do with the companion who had sworn to love him in sickness and in health, in joy and in sadness. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again. There was nothing more to say. Every explanation, every tear, only dug the chasm between them deeper. Without warning, he walked to the bookshelf, picked up a wooden box that he had always kept, a box where, naively, he stored memories of the two of them, concert tickets, handwritten notes, travel photographs. He handed the box into Laura's hands and told her, in the coldest voice he had ever used in his life, for her to take everything. That those memories no longer belonged to her, that love she had buried with her own hands no longer existed. Laura tried to refuse, tried to protest, but Daniel just stared at her, impassive, until she, defeated, hugged the box to her chest and, sobbing, walked through the front door. When the door closed behind her, Daniel felt the crushing weight of loneliness, but also a strange sense of release. The truth, however cruel, was better than comfortable ignorance. Now he knew. Now he could finally start over. And deep down, as broken as he was, there was a budding flame within him, a silent promise that he would not end his days as a victim. The secret that Laura had revealed was only part of the story. What she didn't know, what her lover didn't know, was that Daniel wasn't just a wounded man. He was someone who, once awakened to reality, was capable of acting with a coldness and intelligence that few knew. Something inside him had changed forever, something that would drive him to a subtle and devastating revenge, as precise as a chess master's blow. And as he turned off the lights in the house, letting the darkness embrace him, he was already mentally tracing the first steps of what would be the true outcome of that story. An outcome that no one, absolutely no one, would have been able to predict. Daniel didn't sleep that night. The house seemed colder, emptier, every object seemed to mock the life that had once existed there. Sitting in the living room armchair, with his hands clasped in front of his face, he let the hours drag by until the first ray of sunlight cut through the darkness. It was no longer sadness that consumed him, nor the anger that inflamed his chest. It was something denser, more solid, a calm and cruel certainty that this story needed an ending worthy of what had been taken from it. The silence of the early morning had brought him clarity. He would not seek confrontation, he would not seek to understand anything further. Instead, he would engineer his own ending, one in which he finally regains the control that was stolen from him. The next morning, Daniel took the first step. He didn't hesitate to look for a lawyer, a renowned specialist in family law, known for her strategic coolness. Sitting in front of her, he reported the facts without getting emotional, just punctuating essential details, each word chosen like a domino about to collapse an entire structure. Over the next few weeks, Daniel moved with surgical precision. Without revealing anything to Laura, he began to silently reorganize his life. He removed his name from joint accounts, separated assets, prepared documents. Each movement was made as if dancing with an invisible enemy, with steps that demanded absolute control. At the same time, he worked on his public image, maintaining appearances for those he knew, as if nothing had changed, because he knew that, in the game that was now unfolding, perception would be as sharp a weapon as any documentary evidence. I knew that Laura would try to manipulate the narrative, distort the facts, protect herself under the veil of the repentant victim. He wouldn't allow it. One sultry afternoon, Daniel received a message he didn't expect. It was from Laura, asking to meet, saying that she needed to talk to him, that there was something that couldn't be said over the phone. Against every instinct that told him to ignore her, he responded only with a time and a neutral place, a discreet café, far from any scene that could carry memories. He arrived early and chose a table in the corner, where he could see the entrance. When Laura arrived, he barely recognized her. He seemed to have aged years in a few days, his shoulders hunched, his eyes downcast, his walk hesitant. She sat in front of him without daring to touch him, without even trying to force a smile. The first words took a while to come out. Laura moved her hands nervously on the table, searching his eyes for some spark of compassion that she didn't find. Daniel remained silent, impassive, forcing her to cross the desert she had created. Finally, she murmured that she needed to truly ask for forgiveness, that she needed to tell him something that perhaps he already knew, but that she could no longer bear to carry. Daniel raised an eyebrow, in a gesture of cold curiosity. Laura then revealed that the dinner where they were caught was not an oversight, as she had initially suggested. It was part of a plan for Daniel to see them, for him to catch the betrayal, so that, in some sick way, he would be the one to take the final step towards ending it. Daniel clenched his fists under the table, suppressing the urge to interrupt her. Laura continued, tears streaming silently down her pale face. She said she felt trapped in the life they had, that the comfortable routine had become suffocating for her, that she wanted a new beginning but was too cowardly to ask for it. The lover, taking advantage of this weakness, convinced her that it would be easier if Daniel hated her. That it would be better to hurt him once than to let him suffer through a long, drawn-out separation. Each word was a dagger slowly stabbed into Daniel's chest. Not only did they betray him, not only did they disrespect everything they had built, they also planned to destroy the last thing he had left, his dignity. Without changing his tone of voice, Daniel asked why, if he wanted to free himself so much, he simply hadn't talked to him, hadn't asked for a divorce like an adult. Laura just cried more, saying that she didn't know, that she was afraid, that she got lost in the middle of her own lies. He got up, leaving some notes on the table to pay for the untouched coffee, and before leaving, he looked at her one last time, so small, so disfigured by her own guilt, and said that now she was free, but that she would never have back the man who once loved her above all. And if I thought that was rock bottom, I still had no idea what was coming. Outside, the hot wind blew in Daniel's face as he walked to his car. I didn't take pleasure in Laura's suffering, but I didn't feel sorry either. She had made her choices, she had dug her own abyss. And now, he would do his part. The plan was already in motion. Evidence of the betrayal had been discreetly gathered, witnesses contacted, financial records separated. All set for a court case that would not only ensure Laura left empty-handed, but would also publicly expose all the nastiness she had tried to hide. But Daniel wouldn't stop there. He knew that public humiliation was a powerful weapon, but he also knew that the real blow needed to be more subtle, more cruel. He discovered, through an acquaintance, that Laura's lover had a professional reputation that depended on an impeccable image of integrity and respect. All it took was one well-placed scandal to ruin his career forever. And Daniel, with the calm of someone who knows that patience is revenge's best ally, began to plant the right seeds, in the right places, so that, at the right moment, the truth would explode like a carefully timed bomb. Every move was calculated, every action meticulously planned. Daniel didn't just want revenge. I wanted to ensure that each person involved felt the bitter taste of the fall. I wanted them to know that the betrayed love of a worthy man is more lethal than any blind hatred. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he didn't put himself down. His silence was his sentence, and his determination, the slow, relentless execution of that sentence. When Laura received notification of the lawsuit, her expression of shock was described by mutual friends as that of someone watching the ground collapse beneath their feet. She thought, perhaps, that Daniel, the sweet and patient man she had known, would never have the strength to face her in such a ruthless way. I was wrong. Very wrong. The process demanded restitution of assets, pointed out irrefutable evidence of treason, demanded severe financial compensation and made it clear that any attempt at defamation would be fought even more rigorously. Meanwhile, Laura's lover began to face the consequences of his own foul play. Anonymous complaints emerged, investigations were opened, rumors spread like wildfire. In just a few weeks, his image collapsed in the eyes of superiors, colleagues and society. And Laura, who had thought she had found a new path alongside him, found herself dragged into the same quagmire, isolated, humiliated, with doors closing where there had previously been smiles and invitations. Daniel watched everything from afar, not with pleasure, but with the serenity of someone who knows that justice sometimes needs one's own hands to be done. He didn't want Laura to be destroyed, but he did want her to understand, irrefutably, that her choices had consequences. That you can't play with someone's trust, with someone's life, and get away with it. While Laura and her lover's lives fell apart, Daniel, little by little, rebuilt his own. Not in a hurry, not with desperation, but with the care of someone who knows the price of trusting again. On one of those afternoons when the sun seemed less cruel, he met, unplanned, with someone who, unlike Laura, did not carry the weight of lies in his eyes, but the lightness of someone who had also survived their own storms. However, this was a new story that was still beginning to be written. Before, there was something he needed to do. Something that would end, once and for all, that painful chapter of his life. And that was exactly what Daniel was preparing to do. The court had given the sentence. Daniel left the courtroom without looking back, without searching Laura's eyes for any trace of the woman he had once loved. It was like walking through a door and closing it forever, without the need to lock it, because I knew I would never want to go back. Outside, the overcast sky seemed to mirror the state of his soul, neither hope nor despair, just a strange feeling of emptiness that, in a way, brought relief. Now he was, officially, free. Free from the lies, the manipulations, the wounds she had opened with her own hands. But freedom came with a price he didn't expect. A silent and bitter freedom, a devastated land where a garden once flourished. In the days that followed, Daniel did not rush to seek new directions. He continued working, going for a run in the park as he had always done, maintaining an almost automatic routine while his mind wandered through internal labyrinths that he was still trying to decipher. There was no rush to heal wounds that still hurt at the slightest movement, there was no clear plan for the future other than not repeating the mistakes of the past. And it was in this silent space, in this interval between what was and what could be, that he began to reflect on something that until then he had avoided facing, his own role in everything that had happened. It was easy to blame Laura, to blame the opportunistic lover, to blame the world, but Daniel knew, deep down, that at some point he had walked away too. Small omissions, gestures left for later, words unspoken. He was not to blame for the betrayal, but perhaps he had been complicit in the distancing that opened the way for the tragedy. This dilemma consumed him more than anger or resentment. Looking at yourself and recognizing your own flaws was an arduous and painful task, but necessary. Daniel didn't just want to survive that experience. I wanted to learn, I wanted to grow, I wanted to come out of it someone better, more aware, more present. And that decision, silent and firm, was the first stone on which he would begin to rebuild his life. On one of those gray afternoons, sitting in a little crowded cafe, Daniel met someone who, without him knowing, would be the start of something new. Sophia was a distant acquaintance, someone who had crossed his path at social events, but who had never been more than a cordial and forgotten presence. They met by chance, or maybe not, because life sometimes seems to conspire to put us on the right path when we need it most. She approached with a sincere smile, asking how he was, and the simplicity of the question, without ulterior motives, without disguised pity, was like a balm. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing, with the lightness he no longer knew it was possible to feel. There were no promises, no hasty oaths. Just the feeling that there were still people who saw beyond the scars, that it was still worth believing. But Daniel, although he felt something warm his sleeping chest, knew he couldn't, and didn't want to, rush. It was necessary to give space for the pain to complete its cycle, for the learning to take hold and bear true fruit. And he also knew that, although he was on the path to reconstruction, there were still issues to be resolved. One of them, perhaps the most complex, was the way he would deal with the past. Ignoring it would be like denying a part of yourself. Living trapped in it would be giving up any chance of future happiness. The balance between remembering without destroying yourself and moving forward without carrying the weight of bitterness would be your biggest challenge. It was a minefield of emotions, where each step needed to be calculated, where each memory needed to be given new meaning. In the midst of these reflections, Daniel received a letter. Not a text message, not a rushed email. A handwritten letter, on yellowed paper, in the handwriting he knew so well. It was Laura's. For a moment, he thought about tearing it up without reading it, but something stopped him. He opened the envelope with firm hands, ready for whatever came. The letter did not ask for forgiveness. I didn't beg for a second chance. It was, surprisingly, a genuine apology, with no hope of return. Laura told how her life had disintegrated since the day he left her, how losing Daniel was the highest price she had ever paid for her choices, how her lover, once so full of promises, had abandoned her to her fate in the face of the storm they had both caused. She was also talking about regret, not just for what she did to him, but for what she did to herself. He told how he had lost the respect of his friends, how he had seen doors close one by one, how he had learned, in the most painful way possible, that there was no turning back for some actions. Laura said she didn't write to seek redemption, but because she needed him to know that, despite everything, she still loved him, in a crooked, sick, flawed way, but real in its essence. And that she hoped, one day, that he would find someone who loved him in the right way, with the intensity and loyalty that he deserved. Daniel folded the letter carefully and put it in a drawer. I didn't know if I would ever read it again. He didn't cry, he didn't smile, he just felt, for the first time in a long time, a bitter but necessary peace. It was the end of a cycle. There would be no reunion, there would be no reconciliation. There was just life, taking its course, taking each person along paths that, finally, stopped crossing. As the weeks went by, Daniel began to notice small changes in himself. A closer look at details that I previously ignored, the willingness to listen without rushing, the desire to build something new without pressure, without unrealistic expectations. Sophia continued to be present, without invading, without demanding, just being there, like a silent presence that little by little helped to fill the voids left by the losses. Daniel still bore the marks of betrayal. They would not disappear, they would not be forgotten. But they would also no longer be the frames of his story. They were just scars, silent witnesses to a battle he had survived. The moral dilemma that had haunted him, the doubt about his own role in the tragedy, began to find an answer. He understood now that, although he could have been a more attentive, more present husband, the decision to cheat, to lie, to manipulate, had never been his. Each adult is responsible for their choices, and Laura chose the path that led to their ruin. This awareness, far from freeing him from responsibility for his own mistakes, gave him the strength to build healthier relationships in the future. Relationships based on true dialogue, real presence, mature love. Daniel knew that nothing would guarantee that he wouldn't suffer again. Love, after all, is always a risk. But I would rather take that risk than live in the shadow of distrust and fear. With each step he took, with each dawn he crossed, Daniel felt less a hostage to the past and more master of his own destiny. He was no longer the betrayed man, the abandoned husband. He was a man in reconstruction, in movement, in transformation. And no matter how painful the path was, I knew that there was, yes, life after the fall. He knew that, despite everything, he was still capable of love, and, more importantly, he knew that he deserved to be loved in return, for real. All that was needed was one last gesture to close, once and for all, the chapter that had tormented him for so long. A gesture that would not be one of revenge, nor of bitterness, but of liberation. It was time to take that step. And he already knew exactly how he would do it. One morning, when the wind carried the warm scent of spring that was coming, Daniel decided it was time to close, once and for all, the cycle that still seemed suspended in the air. Despite everything he had already done to rebuild his life, there was one last conversation he needed to have, not to reconnect, not to seek understanding, but so that the wound stopped being an open hole and became just one more scar among many. He sent a short message to Laura, proposing a quick meeting in a discreet cafe where, years ago, they had made plans about children, trips, dreams that now seemed to belong to another life. Her response came quickly, almost anxiously, and Daniel knew that, like him, she also carried within herself the weight of what was left unfinished. When Laura arrived, Daniel was already sitting at the table in the back, absently watching the leaves dancing outside. She entered slowly, looking around as if she still feared encountering ghosts. He approached him hesitantly, and Daniel, without getting up, indicated the chair in front of him with a simple movement of his head. She sat down, and for a moment the silence between them was almost unbearable. It was as if every unspoken word of the last few months hung in the air, loaded with everything that could have been and would never be again. Laura was the first to speak, the hoarse voice of someone who has cried more than she would like to admit. She said she was grateful that he agreed to see her, that she understood that she didn't deserve this gesture, but that, even so, she wanted to hear from him that they were truly free from each other. Daniel stared at her for a few seconds that seemed like hours. There was no longer anger in his eyes, just an old tiredness, a sincere desire to close that chapter without any regrets. He said, firmly, that he didn't hate her, that he would never allow himself to carry hatred, because he knew that this feeling, if cultivated, would end up poisoning only himself. Laura nodded silently, discreet tears running down her haggard face. She tried to justify her actions again, as if, deep down, she was seeking forgiveness that Daniel was not there to grant. He interrupted her gently, saying that he understood that people make mistakes, that they make decisions they regret, but that life is made up of the consequences of those choices, and that they were now just two people who crossed paths and followed different paths. Laura lowered her head, defeated not by him, but by the life she had chosen. The waiter approached and Laura ordered tea while Daniel just asked for water. The words flowed slowly between them, like a river that had lost its strength, but still continued its course to the sea. Laura commented that she intended to leave the city, that she needed to start over somewhere else, away from the judgmental eyes, away from the memories that seemed to cling to the walls of every street. Daniel just nodded. There was nothing left to tie him to the story they lived there, and her departure seemed like the natural consequence of what they had become. When Laura asked about him, about his plans, Daniel smiled in a way he hadn't seen on his own face in a long time. He said he wanted something simple, peace. I wanted to wake up and sleep with a calm mind, without suspicions, without stifled pain. I didn't talk about new loves, not because I didn't believe in them, but because I knew I was still learning to be whole again. Laura smiled too, a sad smile, and said that she hoped he found that she really wanted him to be happy, more than he had ever been with her. Her words sounded sincere, but Daniel knew that even so, they wouldn't be enough to erase what had been done. Forgiving was not forgetting, and he accepted that maturely. I no longer needed to try to patch up the past, I didn't need to pretend it didn't hurt. It was just part of who he was now, and that was okay. The important thing was to move forward without carrying weights that no longer belonged to you. The meeting ended with a handshake, brief, without promises, without expectations. Laura left first, and Daniel watched her walk away until she disappeared around the corner. When he finally turned his gaze in front of him, he took a deep breath, like someone emerging from underwater after being submerged for a long time. I knew, with an unshakable certainty, that from now on everything would be different. Not because the past would be erased, but because he would no longer be a prisoner of it. So he decided to go on a short trip. Not to escape, but to symbolically mark this new beginning. He got in the car, put a small suitcase in the trunk and left without a clear destination, just following the road that crossed green fields and forgotten villages. As he drove, the landscape unfolded like a silent film, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt at peace with himself. It was as if, as he left the familiar streets behind, he also left the ghosts that haunted him. One golden afternoon, he arrived in a small town on the edge of a lake. The place looked like something out of an old book, with colorful houses, cozy cafes, and children playing in the squares. Without thinking much, he decided to stay. He found a simple inn, with rooms that smelled of freshly polished wood and clean linens. He went out for a walk along the lakeshore, feeling the coolness of the water on his face, and, for the first time in a long time, he smiled to himself. As he watched the sunset reflected on the calm surface of the lake, Daniel thought about everything he had experienced. In pain, in losses, in mistakes. But also in the learning, in the strength he discovered in himself, in the ability to move forward even after being broken. I thought that, perhaps, life was just that, falling, getting up, starting over, without ever losing the ability to love and believe. Suddenly, he felt a presence beside him. A woman, perhaps a few years younger than him, was also silently observing the lake. They didn't exchange words, they just shared that simple, pure moment, without expectations, without a past between them. And it was at that moment that Daniel understood that he no longer needed to chase answers or perfect love. Life happened in small encounters, in small choices, in moments when we simply allowed it to flow without resistance. Returning to the inn, he felt the good tiredness of someone who walked a lot, not just on the roads, but within himself. In his room, as he prepared to sleep, Daniel wrote in his notebook something that perhaps one day would become a book or, who knows, just memories to be read on silent nights. We are not defined by the falls we suffer, but by the way we choose to get up. Betrayal is not the end, it is just the fork in the road that forces us to choose another path. And on this new path, who knows, happiness will find us when we least expect it. He fell asleep to the sound of the wind caressing the trees, feeling, deep in his soul, that he was finally free to truly start over. When Daniel returned from that little trip, something inside him had changed irreversibly. He now carried a look that no longer looked to the past for answers to what could no longer be changed. There was no longer the anxiety of trying to understand the incomprehensible, nor the urgent need to correct other people's mistakes. He brought with him the serenity of someone who had made peace with his own scars and decided to use each mark as a testimony to the strength he discovered he possessed. He continued rebuilding his life in silence, working with more purpose, cultivating new habits, meeting old friends who, in a sincere way, celebrated his resilience. And it was in this new rhythm that Daniel met Sophia again, not as a promise of redemption, but as a genuine opportunity for connection. With her, love didn't need to scream, it didn't need to prove itself every moment. It flowed naturally, without the shadow of old fears, without the desperate desire for fulfillment. It was a patient construction, where every gesture and every word was born of truth and respect. While Daniel blossomed into his new chapter, Laura delved into a path of redemption that, although painful, was necessary. After leaving the city, she tried to start over somewhere else, but the mark of her choices followed her, invisible but present in every relationship she tried to establish. The jobs were temporary, the looks were suspicious, the friendships were shallow. Laura discovered that the hardest forgiveness to win was himself. It wasn't enough to want to forget, it was necessary to face yourself in the mirror every day and accept the woman you had become. It took time, tears, and a loneliness that seemed to have no end, but little by little Laura began to find small reasons to believe that, even after destroying so many things, she could still build something different for herself. She began working as a volunteer in institutions that support women in vulnerable situations, not to alleviate the guilt, but to learn the true meaning of empathy and responsibility. He didn't know if he would ever feel completely at peace, but he knew that every gesture, every right choice he made from then on would be another stone on the path to his internal reconstruction. The lover, once so sure of himself, saw his life crumble like a house of cards. The public exposure, the accusations that emerged as echoes of his own arrogance, the social withdrawal, everything came with a speed and violence that he had never anticipated. He lost his job, saw promising businesses evaporate in the face of his tarnished reputation and, to complete the collapse, he faced legal proceedings that drained not only his finances, but also the image of success he had built with so much cynicism. Unable to deal with the loss of status, he isolated himself, spending his days between memories of what could have been and the bitter awareness that he was the architect of his own ruin. Daniel, in turn, decided that it was not enough to just move on, he needed to give new meaning to everything he had experienced. He founded a small company focused on social projects, helping young people develop their careers with ethics and purpose, a direct reflection of what he had learned in his own skin about integrity and the importance of doing the right thing, even when no one is looking. Every story that crossed his path was a reminder that, although the world was imperfect, there were still people willing to fight for the truth, for genuine love, for life in its most sincere form. The months turned into years and, over time, Daniel proposed to Sophia, not in a grand gesture, but in a simple and intimate moment, on the edge of the same lake where everything had started to change. She said yes with tears in her eyes, not from fear or insecurity, but from gratitude for having found in each other the possibility of a clean love, reborn from the ashes of past stories. The ceremony was discreet, surrounded only by those who really mattered. Daniel, when he looked into Sophia's eyes that day, knew that he had finally found not just a new love, but a new way of loving, mature, conscious, true. As for Laura, although she never crossed Daniel's path again, deep down she knew that he had found the peace that she herself was still searching for. Sometimes, she wrote letters that she never sent, venting her guilt, wishing her happiness, silently thanking her for the opportunity to at least learn from the mistake that marked her forever. I knew that they would never be part of each other's lives again and, despite the pain of that realization, I also knew that it was better that way. Daniel continued his life with a clear conscience, without regrets about his choices. I understood that some people come to teach hard lessons, that love is not always meant to last, but everyone has its value. He chose to carry with him not the burden of betrayal, but the courage of having loved, the wisdom of having overcome and the unshakable ability to trust again. His story was not about defeat, it was about rebirth. Today, as he walks hand in hand with Sophia under the sunset, Daniel knows that life will always find a way to rebuild us, to redeem us, as long as we are willing to cross the valley of pain without losing faith in the light that exists beyond. He learned that no matter how many times we are betrayed, disappointed or hurt, there will always be a new chapter waiting to be written, a new chance to be happy. And so this story ends, showing that betrayal destroys dreams and hearts, but it also reveals hidden strengths, opening doors to new beginnings that we never imagined possible. A story that teaches us that the end of a love is not the end of our ability to love, and that, even in the face of the worst disappointments, it is possible to rise again, stronger and more whole than ever. If you liked this story, comment below what you thought and share your opinion, it is very important to us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue following stories that show, without romanticizing, how betrayal can devastate lives and teach profound lessons. And always remember, this channel does not support, in any way, any type of betrayal. Here, we show that truth, respect and true love will always be stronger. See you in the next story. Until then.